a very dark moment for the United States. In less than 24 hours, in 2 different states, 29 innocent lives have been intentionally taken. The entire U.S. is once again shocked by the terrible gun violence that exists in American society. Those 2 horrible incidents have been followed by yet another 2 separate shootings in Chicago on Sunday. Why can't the U.S. follow the example of New Zealand on gun control? Who should take the blame for the increasing gun violence? In the first part of our discussion, I will be joined by Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento, and Liu Hongchuan, senior partner of a Broad and Bright law firm. We shall also be talking to Basina Algerson, CEO of Algerson Global Strategies, who is sitting in Washington. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yao Ray. Welcome to Dialogue. Do you think the latest bloodshed over the weekend is likely to change the status of gun control in the United States?
No. Every time we have one of these shocking shootings that go onto a list of how many people are killed, there's outrage, particularly among Democratic voters, Democratic Party leaders. But the Republican Party is really not invested in gun control laws. The National Rifle Association has so much influence within that party and even somewhat in the Democratic Party. And then the fact it would take a constitutional amendment to really change the right to bear arms that gives the allowance for this, I think we're accustomed that nothing will happen despite the broad outrage.
Again, the presidential tweets of President Trump attracted attention from the world media. What do you think of his latest response towards the vicious cycle of gun violence in the United States? Hong Chuan.
Yeah, I noticed that he did not particularly mention that it is a white nationalist that is getting involved in this sad accident, and I think he has downplayed his influence after he became a president to this event. And I think his obvious anti-immigration attitude has definitely contributed, directly or indirectly, on the increasing gun violence in the states.
Let me cross over to the D.C., where Madam Basima Algerson is standing by. Hello, Basima. The Mexican government says it is planning legal actions against the shootings in Texas. So what do you think of the latest response from the White House?
You know, we continue to see a lack of adequate response from the Republican Party and the White House in general, because the president is a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and he has a large lobbying influence from the National Rifle Association and from certain states and members of Congress who are really non-negotiable on the issues. The unfortunate thing is that we have seen now the increase in hate crimes, in large part probably due to the xenophobic language that President Trump has been using now consistently throughout his 2 years in office.
James, perpetrators of gun violence in the United States are getting younger and younger. Why do you think we see increasing hateful behavior and speech on the internet as well as in the large society?
Well, it's hard to diagnose, but it used to be in the 1980s and 1990s, the shootings were often at work or workplace violence, reaction to being fired by people in their 40s or 50s who'd had some economic and success, and then something went wrong. This new group of young people seem to, reflect a common story, which they're loners, they're antisocial, they were bullied in school, and then they gravitate to this sort of social media messages. And the current one is some of the hateful speech of President Trump, whereas is enabling that kind of speech and then seizing on some of that rhetoric. Some of it's anti-capitalism, anti-modernization technology, and then some of it's anti-immigrant, anti-minority. And so I think it's very shocking that people so young who've just left home have become so disconnected. I think the family doesn't play much of a role in the United States after age 18, and so these people, fall through the cracks, and we don't have profiles of who they may be.
Hong Chuan, cops are investigating into the case in Texas and want to figure out if that shooter was responsible for posting an anti-immigrant manifesto on the internet. Do you think this incident, a tragic one in Texas, is closely related to what happened in New Zealand earlier this year in Christchurch, where 50 Muslims were killed in the church? What do you think of the anti-immigration hate behavior in the society, and do you think this testifies to a global phenomenon?
I certainly think so. I think the gunman himself admitted in his statement that he was encouraged by the actions in New Zealand. So he's definitely influenced by the similar actions in New Zealand. So I think that's the global. And he also mentioned that there's a big difference between the United States and Europe, because in Europe you have very strict control. So even if there's a huge immigration over there, the local people cannot take any actions. But in the States, they think they can make a difference by shooting the people and make their points with a gun.
Basima, let me get back to you with a question on why a video is surfacing again in the United States about how President Trump had responded to a supporter in a public rally where a supporter of President Trump yelled, "Let's kill and shoot and kill those immigrants." Now President Trump obviously responded with a kind of a smile, quote unquote, and that caused strong controversies. What do you think of the immediate response of your president on such an important occasion?
Well, we have seen a consistent strategy by the White House to seize on hatred and fear in the country. So just as former American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stated, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And I think we are seeing that manifested today. So with an increase in hatred and tension, and then as your colleague rightly pointed out in China, these people are empowered by the fact that they have access to high-capacity magazines and weapons. So at least one of the things that Democrats were advocating for in the Obama administration, and I hope will come forward again if and when the Democrats take back the Senate, is the limitation on the types of firearms that are accessible. And just because the Second Amendment gives the right to bear arms doesn't mean that that right should be limited. And we see that precedent, for example, in the First Amendment with the right to speech, of freedom of speech. We still have laws against slander and libel, etc. So there are limitations on rights even in the Constitution.
Do you see any relationship between the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment? Basimo. Now, in 2019 so far, 250 shootings have been reported in 216 days. And those committing the crime are getting younger. What do you think of what the future might hold for gun-related violence? Do you foresee more of such a vicious cycle?
Well, I definitely think we will continue to see an increase in gun violence in the United States as young people, and as my fellow American colleague said, oftentimes these people are loners, they've been bullied, and the ability to shoot a large number of people reinforces, a sense of power within these individuals, which they feel they have been lacking. And so I think we will continue to see copycat attempts, and then as we have, continuously failed to decrease the amount of guns in circulation, I mean, it's very simple. More guns out there equals more gun violence. And so unless we start limiting the types of weapons that are available and also close certain loopholes, like, for example, the gun show loophole, which is essentially that if I buy a weapon from a vendor, there has to be a background check. However, if I own a weapon and I sell it to my neighbor, there's no required documentation on that sale, or if I go to a gun show and I buy a weapon there, there's no documentation on that sale or background check required either. So there are these really big gaps in our system where people are legally able to obtain weapons easily. Of course, there will always be black market sales, but at the very least, we can do our best to limit what the legal options are.
Thank you so much, Basima.
And the tracking mechanism.
Thank you so much. James and Hong Chuan, a look at the U.S. history, one could easily understand why militias are encouraged to arm themselves with live ammunition. Look at the role that National Rifle Association plays in their lobbying efforts. My last question, before we conclude the first part of the discussion today, is what do you think of the impact of media reports that help shape public perceptions about the image of the United States? Because when we come back in the second half, we'll discuss the rebuilding of China's soft power and image of this country. Let's look at the image of the United States, which seems to be beset with media reports on violence.
I think, aside from American foreign policy, which elicits a lot of hostility in parts of the world, the violence that takes place and the gun violence that takes place really undermines the respect and excitement about American society. And from the Chinese student, visiting scholar who was murdered in Illinois, mass shootings of this caliber, I think European countries, Asian countries, the countries you mentioned, Australia, New Zealand, these things are extremely rare. Now, it did happen in New Zealand. It can't eliminate it all, but the frequency that you cited is outrageous, and no repercussions, no change of law. So I think it's quite damning.
But do you think as a result the United States is likely to lose its credibility as a world leadership, since this issue of gun violence seems to be reinforced increasingly by a rise in white supremacy and white nationalism?
Definitely. For people that not grow up and live in the United States, it's very difficult for us to understand why U.S. has such a loose gun control policies, and its social impact is so obvious that so many innocent people has died because of the loose gun control policies. I certainly think that the media can change the perceptions of people about gun control over time, but traditions die hard, so will not change overnight. But if the media and the public continue to educate the people and warn them about the damage that gun can cause, and I think it take a longer time than the position of the public can change.
Whatever the Second Amendment says about the rights of firearms bearing, we keep our fingers crossed for the protection of innocent people. Innocent people should never be killed, whatever happens and whatever the reasons of the perpetrators. Thank you so much. That is all for now around the mass shootings and gun control in the U.S. After we come back from the short break, we will move our sights to the other side of the Pacific. Let's have a look at China's soft power building following the latest Pew survey of Americans' view on China. Stay with us. Welcome back. In our second half of discussion, sitting with Professor James Ray and me is Henry Wang Huiyao, President of the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Ever since I Have a Dream by Reverend Martin Luther King during the Cold War, many, particularly those in China, have never expected the issue of racial discrimination to be so serious that still plagues the United States, the pilot democracy, or a flagship democracy in the world. Henry, we have just discussed in the first part of the program about the impact of gun-related violence and the image of the United States, which is somehow protected by the Second Amendment and, of course, by the lobby of the strong lobby of the National Rifle Association. Let's move on to yet another issue that is somehow related to the same issue of racial discrimination. Recently, the U.S. State Department forced out Ms. Kiron Skinner, who described China as a great power competitor that is not Caucasian. Although no further details have been given regarding why she was fired, it seems this move is emphasizing no space for racism in the U.S. government. How do you look at her removal?
Well, I think that's probably one of the good news that I think that been recently coming out of U.S. I mean, of course, in addition to also President Trump said positive on Hong Kong that this is only an internal matter of China. But I think this move by State Department of removal Ms. Skinner, I think would be probably interpreted as probably associated with her remarks that China is fighting not a traditional war, but with the Caucasian as Western countries. So I think that probably shows no tolerance. I think at least U.S. State Department is correcting some of her mistakes, then particularly the bad image impact that she has influenced the public with those bad words that she had on China.
The controversial remarks by Ms. Skinner drew a lot of fire from within the U.S. government and the media, scholars included. So, James, what do you think of the implications of her removal? What do you think of, say, the efforts by the U.S. government to tone down racial implementations?
I think
yes, implications.
I think the removal maybe have more to do with her management style. I don't think the Trump administration is renouncing her racial remarks, and she was in preparation of this long memo that would outline China as kind of an existential threat. I don't think her removal changes the step-by-step labeling of China as an enemy, as a hostile actor of the Trump administration with the trade war, with the military, sense of a military rivalry. And I do think race plays a role in American thinking. It's always been a more Atlantic-centric country. Even when Japan is a partner of the United States, I don't think Japan is treated equally as the Europeans are. And so I think the racial dynamic may not be front and center, but I think it's implicit and even probably more elevated in this administration.
James, ever since Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University raised the theory on civilization clashes, the controversial remarks by Ms. Skinner reminded us of the long and deep-rooted issue of racial discrimination. China obviously walks its own path in modernizing this country in many ways. Do you think the Western media portrayal of China as a revisionist power is very helpful in promoting their precise understanding about what is really going on in our country?
Well, no, not necessarily. I think that the West countries, after China joined WTO, opened up for decades, and in the last WTO for the last 18 years, Western countries expect China to converge. But now they see China has been thriving and embraced globalization, but more on a more independent and unique path. So that actually been also interpreted as a revisionist, because China may do things differently. So that's, I think, not only ideologically, but also in terms of emphasize infrastructure, emphasize the central planning, and emphasize some of those, which shows very effectively in China. That actually has been able to lifting 900 million out of poverty. That kind of things is people in the Western country interpreting with a mixed feeling. So they think on the one hand you did not converge, on the other hand you are revision, the traditional liberal international order, which means that democracy, freedom of everything. So that's probably what they mean by that.
Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S.-led world order helps to promote neoliberalism, which is ironically fast receding into historical insignificance with the emergence of new industrialization, new industrialized countries such as China, the most dynamic emerging market. So what are the major issues concerning the image of China while it's rising so fast and it's getting so close to the center stage of world affairs? James?
Well, in America, the fear is always of the military rise of China, which I think is actually not the concern, and I don't think the revisionism is always placed as a security challenge to American hegemony. I think China's economic model of a state-led orientation, building the AIIB and the Silk Road, is the real challenge to the American liberal order, and that is not so much the focus of the U.S. past administrations till Trump, where he's adopting this kind of trade war tactics. So I think American image on the left looks at transparency, issues of rights in China. On the right looks at the rise of the military. They have competing fears of China. but that we see the really low opinions of China across a multitude of spectrums.
There's quite a few, I think there's quite a few things that actually Americans didn't expect. China was being able to so quickly become the second largest economy, and also the efficiency and effectiveness of this Chinese path is really produced miracles. For example, you know, the infrastructure development, China, the speed railway, kilometers, the total length in China equal to the 9 countries next combined. Whereas U.S. military budget is equal to 9 countries next combined. So you can see the difference. That China put all the money and in the infrastructure, whereas all the rest of the world is stand still. So I think that's probably also produced a lot of misunderstanding or maybe fear, as James said, that on China's speed of development.
Had the United States not gone to 2 wars in the wake of September the 11th terrorist attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States may have built their own developed far-flung network of infrastructure, like what happens in China. That's what Jack Ma says in the winter Davos forum in Switzerland. So what do you think of, say, Now, James, I'd like to ask you, you have stayed in China for a number of years, and you have got a very close relationship with the younger generation. It is the young who believe that the future matters more to them. How do the younger generation in China look at the future of their own country in contrast with the external perceptions of my country, China?
Well, I think young students in China absorb the view that America is a dangerous country because it's too much freedom and too much gun rights and so forth, and that a strong state will provide security. I think that is one outlook of many young students. I think at the same time, young people in China are using this Douyin and the Xiaohongshu, the Little Red Book, and these apps and video games, and are so absorbed in technology and material concerns that they may not be in tune to political messaging and become very individualistic and actually become sort of like Americans in their seeking an individual happiness and fun and traveling and doing those kind of things.
I wonder if you both have noticed the latest box office record, Ne Zha, which portrays the rebellious character of a legendary figure through animated film. And that somehow shows clearly the popularity of a rebellious spirit for the younger generation. On the one hand, they are humbled by the traditional culture of being obedient to form the family culture. On the other hand, it seems they are walking their own path of independence. So what do you think of the mind of the younger generation in examining what the future means for them?
Well, I think today, you know, in the 21st century, contemporary world, in an era of globalization, the young people are much different than their former generations. Mm-hmm. I mean, the film you just mentioned, I saw it. You know, it really, you have to do your own thing, respect your own decision, make your own choices. That is the spirit I think carried out in the movie. But on the other hand, that's also the technology generation mm-hmm. would rather have. Nowadays, they have a Google, they have a Baidu, they knows everything now in the world. They don't need, and then they can express themselves through WeChat, through all the social media. So they become much more independent, and also they are much more fast response to the new novelty and new technology development. So I think that is the characteristic that Chinese generation, younger generation have, and that's also in common with the rest of the world have. So now is who actually can best, you know, harness this power. Who can best utilize this capacity, who really have the upper hand. So I think that's probably the most important. Well, China has, you know, each year has about 9 million university graduates. Since the last 4 decades, have 100 million college graduates. China is certainly in the driver's seat, I mean, to some extent, in terms of all this generation powered by the technology unleashed.
It's taken for granted that the development and sustainability of the Chinese economy will very much be driven by the spirit of innovation. Let's look at the latest article of South China Morning Post, which recently pointed out in one of his editorials that China needs to embrace new media. Let me go back to what Henry Wang said in his analysis about the competitiveness of the Chinese economy. But this article says China needs strategy plans and a way to respond quickly before tweeting or, more importantly, replying, other than the remarks of the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry and the State Council. What do you think of the use of social media in our response to Western perceptions of China?
Well, I think it's the future of diplomacy, is being able to manage social media. There was a little bit of tension when one Chinese foreign ministry official tweeted and the U.S. Susan Rice reacted. I think that's the training that will come with being on the global stage. And I'd also maybe just jump in with talking about films. The Wolf Warrior films also kind of show this, I think, new thinking where there's an individual who sort of breaks away from the PLA's guidance to be a hero, and then represents China's kind of participation in global affairs. So I think social media, new media, film, all these things, China's going to be playing a role and is just sort of coming online to be sophisticated in that area.
Before we conclude the discussion, Harry, let's look at Hong Kong, where the defiance, dissatisfaction and anger of the young protesting in the streets of the territory show that these people have a different understanding about governing Hong Kong by Hong Kong people in one country, two systems. We are looking at the efforts to rebuild soft power, and Hong Kong is, of course, part of China since 1997 when it returned to the sovereignty of the Chinese mainland. I'd like to have your thoughts very quickly.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I mean, the social response, social media response. I mean, the Ambassador Cui Tiankai has opened his Twitter, and the Chief Editor Hu Xijing has his Twitter. I think China should open Twitter. Let all the intellectuals and students come on the Twitter, so that the social response can be faster. Now you only hear the student from Hong Kong, but you don't hear the student from mainland. So I think there's a big, huge deficit of communication between the mainland and Hong Kong. And also younger generation in Hong Kong doesn't see their future. So I think their future is actually highly linked with the Great Bay Area. So that if they can really have family established in the Pearl River Delta, have a husband and wife there, they would be in peace. So I think that's fundamentally how we should solve that from long-term view, give them the future of tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Harry and James. That's it for this edition of Dialogue, the second half of a program about the future of China and perhaps the future of Hong Kong. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.